Welcome to week 4 of our time together. We have a couple of parallels that we want to look at this week, and that is medieval China, medieval Europe. Um, Both China and Europe are grappling with chaotic events, the collapse of empires, the emergence of emulative societies that are not quite the same as those that came before. In order to do that, we should probably look at some terms. Now, first is a term that historians love to use. It's called hegemony. Hegemony is essentially the influence that one society has over another. Now, this could be direct military hegemony, like your threat of invasion. A good example of that would be the United States having a very large military and able to project its power across the globe. So that's a military hegemony. There's also cultural hegemony, which is the practices, the uh, ideas of a society that kind of permeate and percolate outside of the society. Now, all societies kind of cross-pollinate. There are no so-called pure societies, except for maybe small tribal bands deep in the Amazon who have never had contact with anybody else ever. So, for example, things like hamburgers in the United States. Sounds very American, doesn't it? Actually, it came from Germany. This idea of a Hamburg sandwich, right? Or hot dogs, Frankfurters. Those come from Germany also. Or things like eating rice. That's a very Asian influence, right? It even goes back to the 17th and 16th century. In the United States, we started growing rice in the Carolinas because the environment was perfect for it, because it was a luxury resource, and eating rice was a sign of affluence, right? So that's cultural hegemony. And there's also political hegemony, which is the influence of internal processes in other countries by a exporting country. A good example of this would be in diplomatic papers, things are still written in French. It's largely because the French Empire was relatively large, very influential, very good at negotiating treaties and that sort of thing. And also, France was the language of diplomacy in the late medieval period and into the early modern period. If you wanted to have something spelled out, if you want to have an agreement between two countries, you did it in French so that everybody understood. It's in very many ways similar to how prominent Latin is. Mahayana Buddhism is a thread or a permutation of Buddhism that alters some of the messages, some of the central tenets of original Buddhist middle path. And Mahayana Buddhism is really adopted into China and some other East Asian societies. Now, there's other varieties like Theravada Buddhism and Zen Buddhism that are even further permutations beyond that. But for our purposes, Mahayana Buddhism plays a huge role in Chinese society because it offers messianic figures, bodhisattvas, which are saints who have held off achieving enlightenment, achieving nirvana, in order to help others achieve enlightenment. So they are leaders of communities. And there are many Buddhas. Buddha is a term that's given to somebody who has achieved enlightenment. So these bodhisattvas could be considered Buddhas. A good example of that would be the fat laughing Buddha you might find in Asian restaurants. That is not the Buddha, but one of many Buddhas. The feudal system is a complex term and a very controversial term in historical circles. For our purposes, we're going to strip it down a little bit and we're going to bridge what you might think of as feudal and what historians might possibly use as the term feudal. Essentially, it is a balance of obligations and protections which ensures that society remains stable. Now, a lot of people think of feudal society as serfs working and toiling away and not in charge of their labor and having to give everything to a tyrannical lord. Well, part of that is true. Yes, the labor was a way that they paid taxes, whether it was through crops or through actual labor, such as building roads or dams or bridges or whatever like that, as a day laborer. Uh, but also, the Lord would not last very long as a Lord if they were constantly tyrannical. Now, could they act mercurial and capricious and kind of mean? Yeah, absolutely. They did. People in power are like that. People who acquire power, particularly through birth, tend to view others as less than. It's just a fact. It takes a very rare individual who doesn't do that. So, but if a lord was constantly starving his serfs to the point where they couldn't eat, where they were too weak to work the fields, guess who's not getting taxes this year? Because you can't beat somebody who's on their deathbed from starvation and make them go out and work in the fields. It just doesn't work that way, as the English found out with the Irish potato famine in the 1840s. So feudalism is a very strange kind of concept. It's this mutual obligation where the lord has to give to his serfs, and it's almost always his. Very rarely is it a her. Occasionally we do have some, but the lord was required to put on feasts for saints' days. So actually, serfs had more holidays than modern American workers do, somewhere in the order of 30 something holidays, feast days, in which the Lord was expected to provide at least some kind of party or food or entertainment or something like that. There were also legal precedents that we won't get into here because we're starting to get a little more complicated. But essentially, it is yes, there is a social hierarchy. Yes, serfs were unfree laborers, but they also had a lot of tricks up their sleeves. Okay, so speaking of serfs, as I mentioned before, they are unfree peasants. They are treated as part of the land. If a lord buys or comes into possession of a piece of land, he also comes into possession of these serfs. Technically, they're not slaves because you don't own the person. You own the land upon which the person works, and the person must be tied to the land. So it's a very kind of roundabout kind of slavery. But essentially, serfs make up the majority of labor in early medieval period. Now, several factors, including environmental factors, make it easier to have a larger population. So you have relatively less people working as serfs who are harvesting the land or working the land to grow crops, and you have more and more people working as traders or merchants or uh, artisans in cities, or maybe they would enlist in military, become mercenaries, foot soldiers. Sometimes they were drafted into militaries, and that all changes around the 14th century, and we'll get to why that happens at a later lecture. We're going to start off with China, and China the Chinese society had achieved a kind of golden age under the Han Dynasty. After the fall of the Qin Dynasty, which only lasted two rulers, we have Qin Shi Huangdi and his son. The son was overthrown, and we have the Han Dynasty, which lasts a good 500 years. And they um, were the preeminent power in Asia, one of the richest societies on the planet. and as such, they had great influence. So when Buddhism was brought into China along the Silk Road, because it was very popular amongst merchants who felt that they were underserved in the Hindu hierarchy under Brahmin tutelage. They could never really stay around long enough. Their livelihood depended on trade and moving, so they couldn't stay around long enough, and sometimes they didn't have enough money to participate in some of these ceremonies, so their cosmic karma never really enhanced their status, so they were stuck in the middle. Buddhism, however, allows them the freedom to uh, pursue their livelihood, but also pursue individual freedom from the cycle of life and death and pain and suffering, right? So a spiritual freedom as well as an economic freedom. And that comes into China along the Silk Road. Now, one of the things that I really should clarify is Silk Road is a 19th century term created by historians to talk about the trade networks that were set up between China, primarily China, and Europe. And these Silk Roads go both by the ocean-going routes, so there were Silk naval roads, I guess, or seafaring roads, but there were also land routes as well. And it wasn't common, although it did occasionally happen, for a single merchant to travel the length and breadth of this trade network. It would take you years to walk from China to, say, Europe, or it would take you several months to walk from India to China, for example. But they did do it. And when they interacted with people, they talked about things that are outside of business. They talk about their families, they talk about their beliefs. And so that's how this Buddhism begins to spread. And this Buddhism begins to adopt new aspects as it spreads, and it kind of permeates into new cultures. And you start getting this Mahayana, what we know as Mahayana Buddhism, um, begins to really take root in China. And it comes at an opportune time because the Han Dynasty is declining and actually falls into chaos. It falls into three warring states, the so-called Three Kingdoms period. There's a very famous novel, kind of a heroic epic called The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, of these brothers who are trying to stop the Han Dynasty from falling apart. And unlike in reality, their heroic efforts do keep the Han Dynasty kind of limping along and continuing. The reality is China does fall into three periods, three warring kingdoms, and so there's a lot of chaos. And so people are looking to Buddhism for a comfort that they can't find in Confucian philosophy, that they can't find in Taoist philosophy, that they can't find in legalism. And so Buddhism, especially Mahayana Buddhism, offers this concept or these tenets, this idea of mercy and acting merciful towards other people, and that there is a Buddha who is able to grant mercy. And so, in many ways, Buddhism goes from being a philosophy of individual freedom to becoming a messianic religion, that the Buddha can take away my pain, that he will, if I am enlightened enough, he will have mercy upon me. He will give me hope that there is love in the world. And give you an idea of what I'm talking about with the different routes that it could have taken into China. And here we have the penetration of Mahayana Buddhism into China, and then from China and into other societies. Koguryo, which is also known as Korea now, and then into Japan, back into Tibet, where you get the changes of different types of Buddhism. If you go to Tibet, there are many different Buddhisms, and down into Southeast Asia. You also get other forms of Buddhism like Theravada Buddhism and Zen Buddhism and a couple of others as well that alter because of the societies that they meet first and then penetrate into China as well. So you have many different Buddhisms running around in China, much like we have many different types of Christianity in the Western civilization. So Mahayana Buddhism is, as I mentioned before, the alteration of the original Buddhism. And we have these messianic figures. Bodhisattvas are kind of uh, mentors, spiritual mentors. You could call them wise men, yogis, saints, uh, um, masters, that sort of thing. And they would lead communities, they would lead groups of people to a form of enlightenment, to a form of community that sought to support each other. Now, this is a little bit different from Christianity in that there is no central authority in Buddhism. In many ways, it's very much like Islam in that each community leader can emphasize or de-emphasize certain aspects, but there are broad stroke themes and broad stroke ideas that all of these adhere to. And it's an amalgam of different teaching philosophies. And some of them are not necessarily Buddhist to begin with. And that's an important thing to note as we talk about religions. Religions, as I may have noted before, are living things. They are practiced by living people in different societies. And I believe I may have pointed out if you go to different communities, Christian churches, for example, if you go to a Korean Christian church, and if they have a depiction of Christ, he looks Korean. If you go to an Ethiopian church and you see a depiction of Christ, he looks Ethiopian. If you go to a Lebanese church and you find Lebanese Christians and they have a depiction of Christ, he looks Lebanese. Just like if you go to a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant church, he looks waspy, although a little bit more long-haired and of course with a beard. But Jesus with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a thin trimmed beard would have been a very strange sight in the first millennium or the first century AD in the Middle East. Would have been a very strange sight. Not unprecedented, but definitely not born there, right? So we have the same thing happening with Buddhism. Some of the teachings of Mahayana Buddhism are sometimes contradictory to the original middle path. For example, there is a de-emphasis on release from or personal release from the cycle of suffering and attaining nirvana. Instead, there is more of an emphasis on living justly, living modestly, essentially trying to cultivate a sense of community, a sense of simplicity, a sense of reverence for the world around you. And as I mentioned before, and as I showed with the map, Buddhism penetrates into these other countries. Well, why does it go where it goes? Well, because the Mahayana Buddhism in particular is seen as part of Chinese culture, much like the hamburger is seen as part of American culture, even though it didn't originate in America. Same thing with French fries, same thing with apple pie, you name it, right? There's things that are associated with a culture erroneously that a culture has just through dint of its size and its power kind of appropriated. And so Buddhism is like that. And so it penetrates into Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Tibet, and further. And in that process, it infuses its philosophy with some Confucian teachings. The idea of living modestly is not disaligned with Buddhism, but the idea of reverence for ancestors, the reverence for those who have come before you, is not articulated in original middle path Buddhism. It is, however, emphasized in Mahayana Buddhism. You also get this Taoist teachings, which influence Zen Buddhism. The Taoist teaching is that the more you learn, the less you know, essentially. And so Zen is more like the unthinking contemplation, just knowing how to do something by allowing the spirit to move you or allowing the universe to move you. And of course, Buddhism is also adopted by rulers in various countries, in various warring states, uh, in order to legitimize their rule, and so thus popularize it, much like Christianity is adopted by, say, the Franks. And they use Christianity to legitimize their rule, and then they use their power, their rule, to spread Christianity. So there are more Christian Buddhist parallels, by the way. Both China and Europe see the establishment of monasteries in these dark, tumultuous periods after the empire's fall. For China, it's the 3rd century AD. For Europe, it's more like the 5th century AD. So we're a little time laggy, but we're looking at shared themes. Um, in Europe, you have the establishment of monasteries, and part of the mission of monasteries is to preserve knowledge, preserve the writings and learning from the classic period, from the Roman period. Same thing is happening in China. These Buddhist monasteries, part of their mission is to preserve learning, because the Buddha was very keen that people learn about the natural world, and so there were universities established in Asia dedicated to learning. There were universities established in China dedicated to learning. And during this dark period, during this collapsing period, of course, the funding for these universities go away. That's usually a good sign that a society is kind of in trouble when they stop patronizing learning. Universities and schools and that sort of thing, libraries. And so these Buddhist monks began to preserve some of the ancient Chinese understandings. And not only did they preserve it, both groups, both the Christian monks and the Buddhist monks, not only preserved it, but they also commented upon it, learned from it, and even kind of articulated further some of the learnings there. And so they kind of kept it moving forward unofficially. A very slow progress, but progress nonetheless. We also have the emergence of priestly groups in both Europe and in Asia at about this time. Now, there were priests absolutely in China. There were priests absolutely in Europe, but this is the first time that they become really officially recognized in many aspects as part of a government bureaucracy. When China does emerge from these dark ages, some of the groups that become influential are Buddhist priests, Buddhist monks. And then the same is true in Europe. When Europe does kind of emerge from this chaotic period of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, there are priests who emerge. There are also divergent beliefs that, for example, not all Buddhists are pacifists. Original Buddhism believed in pacifism, non-violence, right? It's kind of a trait that it borrows from not Hinduism but Jainism. Jainism is a very pacifist religion, similar to Hinduism in many respects, the same way that Buddhism is, and Buddhism borrowed that pacifism. Much like Christianity, theoretically, is a pacifist religion, theoretically. But not all practitioners of Buddhism are pacifists in the same way that not all practitioners of Christianity are pacifists. Let me give you an example. In the 5th century, there is a monk who comes from Nepal and either Nepal or India. The stories are kind of vague about it. And he receives this vision of a forest mountain. And he begins a pilgrimage to find this forest mountain. And he eventually finds a mountain in China called Mount Shaoshi, which means literally the forest mountain. and he establishes a monastery there. And he establishes this monastery in order to contemplate the natural world and to learn the lessons that he can from the natural world. And of course, because he's a mysterious man on a mountain contemplating life, the universe, and everything, everyone wants to know what's the answer. And so people begin to join him, much like in monasteries in Europe, right? Um, Saint Benedict, for example, wanted to be left alone. He wanted to live in a cave and have food delivered to him in a bucket once a day, and that was it. But then people started going, wow, maybe he's onto something. Let me go live in the cave with him and see if I can learn what he's learning, right? So the same thing is kind of happening. Eventually, because it becomes relatively um, a relatively unguarded community during a chaotic period, they are occasionally raided by either troops or by bandits or outlaws or stuff like that. And so they use their contemplation of the natural world to learn to defend themselves. And so we have the Shaolin temples begin to emerge. The monks learn to defend themselves with everyday items, whatever could be laid at hand. Why? Well, part of it is explained that, well, monks don't carry weapons. We're not aggressive. If you carry a sword, you're going to think that you can solve every problem with a sword. However, if you carry nothing, you can only solve problems with your mind. So you have to be able to talk your way out of it, think your way out of it, rationalize your way out of it, or at the very end of the day, defend yourself with whatever you can find. If it's a staff, if it's a farm implement, or something like that. And while they were fighting, they used fighting to achieve a state of Zen, which is being able to act without thinking too much about it, being able to anticipate how the opponent will react, and to eventually be able to block out all the little distractions. You get this perfect sense of focus called samadhi. And during that period, when you're in samadhi, you're able to ignore pain, you focus your concentration, and then you eventually get to expend the internal energy that you have outward. So you're able to hit harder than you normally would. You've probably seen people breaking bricks with their fists. They could uh, be able to punch somebody harder than their muscle mass should allow, that sort of thing. So that's what we mean by expending internal energy outward. Now to the monks, they saw this as a literal energy, like you were pulling chi from your body and expending it, kind of like a laser beam through your hand, kind of thing. Uh, but for our purposes, we'll look at it a little bit less mystically and say that they were able to tap into reserves of energy, or maybe to override those controls that keep humans from using the full potential of their muscles at all times. But they didn't just focus on self-defense. Buddhist monks also focused on preserving the medical legacy of the Han Dynasty. Now, traditional medicine in China, or herbalism, was very kind of ad hoc up until about the 2nd century AD. Right around that time, the scholars and the physicians of the Han Dynasty, because it was the height of the Han Dynasty, began to codify this and began to come up with rules about how to use what herb when to be able to cure people of illnesses effectively without you go and see one doctor and they make you ill. You go and see a different doctor, they don't really do anything, and it takes you several doctors to finally find the cure to your ailment. It's kind of nice to have a standardized practice with regulations in place. And so the Buddhist monks and Confucian monks as well uh, devote themselves to preserving this medical knowledge. Temples and monasteries then become centers of healing as well, where if you are injured or you are ill, you would go to these monasteries, kind of like going to a hospital. In Chinese herbalism, the Energy flowing through your body takes 5 states along the meridians, and these meridians can become imbalanced, and that imbalance is what causes affliction. And the medicine needs to either encourage a flow or overcome an improper amount of flow in order to stabilize and keep in harmony the 5 major organs of the body. And each of these organs are associated with a Chinese version of the elements. Now, in classic Greek elements, we have earth, wind, fire, and water. We could add a fifth element, and that is the human spirit into that. And a lot of these treatments in China are similar in many respects, although they do diverge, and you can almost see like, oh yeah, I could see where that would be considered an element. And these elements are water, metal, fire, earth, and wood. Wood is more flexible than metal is. Metal is unyielding. Metal is stability. Water is motion. Earth is that kind of groundedness, that the ability to understand. And of course, fire is your passion. So. So these three kingdoms period, this chaotic period, herbalists began to articulate a path to personal health and communal harmony that went in concert with the Buddhist teachings, and to a lesser degree with Confucian teachings, but more so with Buddhist teachings. And so a lot of these monasteries began to encourage what began as calisthenics to promote not only fitness of body, but to promote the flow of qi. So things like kung fu. Kung fu were initially taught to strengthen muscles, to regulate your breathing, and to help you improve your concentration. This would later morph into Tai Chi, which is also used today in a similar vein to strengthen your muscles, to regulate your breathing, to essentially improve the balance of your qi. They also promoted the idea of eating well. And this may not come as a surprise for you, but turns out eating mostly vegetables, is good for you. And that's what the Chinese said. Vegetable-based diet, fruits and vegetables are the best for you. You can have meat, yes. You can have yogurt, you can have things like that, yes. Totally fine. But you have to have it in moderation. Don't gorge yourself on meat. For example, there's a Buddhist story where a king was extremely wealthy, but he was extremely unhappy, and he dealt with bouts of depression, what they called melancholy, and so he asked all the learned scholars, what should he do? And, the acupuncturist comes in and tries to balance his chi that way, and it doesn't work. And he has a kung fu master come in and teach him martial arts to balance his chi, and it doesn't work that way. He's still feeling upset. His stomach is upset. He can't sleep at night. He can't love his wife. He can't get it up in order to love his wife. And so eventually he comes to a Buddhist teacher, and the Buddhist teacher tells him to start eating more vegetables, and essentially that he was doing part of the medicine, but he wasn't doing all of the medicine. So acupuncture was good, and acupuncture helps. Calisthenics was good. Calisthenic helps. But in order to complete the journey and to make yourself more healthy is to embrace eating right. So he was doing correct body maintenance. He was doing correct breathing and concentration. Now he had to balance his diet as well, because what goes into you is what comprises you. And that essentially moderation, that you can have meat, just don't go overboard. Don't make it all meat all the time. Eat your vegetables. And that this was necessary for disease prevention. Interestingly enough, and separate from the European experience. Uh, Monks in Europe were also promoting uh, Hippocrates and Galen's axioms to eat more vegetables, that food can be medicine, that you can, if you eat healthy food, if you eat vegetables and grains and fruit in their whole form, you'll be fine. You will live a long, happy, healthy life. Will you get disease? Possibly. Will you get fewer diseases than those who don't eat that way? Absolutely. So there's very many parallels between the Buddhist teachings of diet and the importance of health with the Greco-Roman uh, idea of health and diet being interlinked. So the Chinese are really, really powerful, and they're seen as the best culture by neighbors, even during the Warring States period, because these Warring States individually are even more powerful than their neighbors. Now imagine when they're together, uh, how powerful the Chinese truly are. You can imagine how powerful the United States would be if we broke into three different pieces and each had our own little society, our own little military, and our own money. We would still be extremely powerful, right? So the culture was imitated by Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and this is the that that hegemony that we're talking about spreading through. And Chinese wealth eventually is rebuilt through trade and conquest. Eventually, the three periods or the three kingdoms period is over, and a new dynasty re-emerges. And one of the first ways that they consolidate power is promoting trade, international trade, and also, of course, through conquest. And the Chinese become the yardstick by which other cultures are measured. And that's true in Europe as well. We'll talk about the Franks. For that, so we'll go ahead and shift gears to the medieval Franks. Now, we're going to roll back the clock a little bit here, and we're going to talk about medieval Europe uh, at the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Now, we have to be very careful to say that the Roman Empire itself, themselves, do not disappear during this period. A lot of people think the Roman Empire period disappeared around the 5th century, early 6th century. That's not true. As you can see here on this map, we have Eastern Roman Empire, what sometimes is called the Byzantines. The Byzantines are the inheritors of the remnants of the Roman Empire. And you'll have read in your books about how the empire had gotten so big and was so mismanaged and so fractious that it was actually divided into two parts. You have the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. And technically they were co-equal. The reality was the Eastern Roman Empire was more wealthy, more powerful, more influential. And the Western Roman portion, which included Rome as well, was much less powerful, much weaker. And thus it collapsed. It kind of slid into decay, and its legal systems broke down, its judicial systems broke down, its educational systems broke down. And so we have these so-called invasions of the Roman Empire that start around the 1st century, but really pick up around the 5th century. Now, I say invasions, but it's not really like a bunch of armies came marching in. Some did. Well, the Visigoths, for example, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, they did come in. Huns absolutely came in and tried to invade. However, most did not. Most kind of just filled in the vacuum. So Anglos, Saxons, Jutes, Goths, Franks, they were filling in the vacuum that was left by the withdrawal of Roman administration and Roman military might. And that leads us to the question, was it really a collapse or was it more of a slide? And I'm of the slide variety, as are most serious historians. This whole myth of the Roman collapse happening like overnight is actually an 18th century uh, um, one 18th century historian who was actually critiquing Christianity as a religion, that Christianity's pacifism made the Romans weak, and therefore Christianity is a blight upon societies that want to be strong. So we're going to go ahead and leave that alone. So the Roman Empire was large and already divided politically and increasingly divided culturally. One of the attempts to reunify the Roman Empire was Emperor Constantine establishing Christianity as an official religion of the Roman Empire. It's not the official religion, it is a official religion. There are still pagans, there are still polytheists, and they are encouraged, but now denigration and persecution of the Christian faith is no longer to be tolerated. And in fact, part of the idea behind embracing Christianity was that it was becoming increasingly popular. And it offered a route to unity that the polytheist religions did not. First off, there was one God. There weren't a multiplicity of gods. They had relatively clear lines of power. You prayed to that God, and that God alone is the one who gave favor or took it away. And so this allows Emperor Constantine to say, hey, I am the messenger of God on earth. You must listen to me. And so that helps unify some of the Roman Empire. He also establishes Christian orthodoxy. The so-called Nicene Creed comes out because of this meeting in the city of Nicaea. And they kind of hammer out what would become orthodox or mainstream Christianity. The four Gospels, for example, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They weren't the only four Gospels floating around there. There were a lot of Gospels. Each community had a different emphasis on different aspects of Christianity. And so this Nicene Council pared everything down. And so this is in the this is the in the fourth century that they did this. So it's 400 years after the death of Christ, and they codify the Bible. They argue and debate over what gospels, and they finally fall upon four gospels that are relatively coherent and relatively within the mainstream that they agree with. And so a committee put the Bible together. And later on, you get the King James Version that happens in the 14th century. So a good 1400 years after the death of Christ, but and they attempt to rearrange and re-emphasize the teachings of the Bible, but they wind up cutting a few things out here, adding a few things there. It's mostly just kind of like putting a new coat of paint and maybe adding a bathroom to your house kind of thing. It's still your house, right? The Germanic tribes that initially came in were interested in becoming Roman citizens. Alaric of the Goths, who eventually does sack Rome, he brings his people into the Roman Empire because he wanted to become a Roman citizen. He wanted his people to become Roman citizens and have the protections of Rome. Rome kind of hung him and his people out to dry, left him as a buffer against other more serious military invasions. So Alaric and his Goths made a kind of a million-man march kind of deal to the capital, made demands. The emperor uh, agreed to these demands, but the Senate vetoed him, so they burned Rome. So there you go. So Alaric sacked Rome about 400 in CE. All reports were that Alaric was heartbroken at having to sack Rome, but his men needed blood. There had to be some kind of retribution for leaving his people out to dry. Later Germanic invaders also mimicked Roman society and the military. They were thoroughly Romanized. They spoke Latin, or at least they were bilingual in speaking Latin and their native tongues. They tried to emulate everything about Rome. They rebuilt roads. They adopted the titles of Roman leaders. They they emulated Roman military tactics and Roman military organization, and so it wasn't like the Germans came in and smashed everything. They didn't. It was really um, the nature or nature itself abhorring a vacuum. The Romans had burned their own house down. They had already imploded their own society. And so, in the vacuum of that society, a new society is brought in that tries to emulate the glory days of the past and try to do something a little bit better than the Romans did. And that leads to the Franks. Now, the Franks kind of sidle into what is now modern day France, from which the country gets the name. Uh, in Roman period, it was called the Gauls. So sometimes you hear the Gallic ties or very Gaulish. That is a reference to the region as it was known during the Roman times. It becomes known as France because the Franks become the main tribe that are controlling most of Western Europe. And they're composed of different clans, so it's not just one unified kingdom just up and moving in. There's a bunch of different clans, and two of which are extremely powerful. You have the most powerful, called the Merovingians. They have a semi mythical origin story where their legendary founding king was a guy named Merovac. He was part sea monster and part human, so he was a demigod. And then, of course, you have the Carolingians that harken back to Carolus, which is this very noble fighter, this kind of like Beowulf-like figure. And they come into France, or they come into Gaul, and they begin to rebuild the villas of the Romans, but they also fortify them. So they make kind of proto castles, early castles, and so they are in a way emulating the Romans, but they're also kind of putting their own spin on it because they're a little bit more pragmatic. It's a very tumultuous period. They have a lot of enemies. The former Roman citizens themselves, who are kind of objecting to this new tribe moving in, are not very friendly, and so they have to protect their homes, for example. The Franks, particularly the Merovingians, begin to support and sponsor the church, which begins a trend in Europe of uh, leaders sponsoring the Catholic Church, particularly monasteries. They build and establish monasteries. They sponsor and uphold bishoprics, the areas in which bishops operate. They divide their territories up by diocese, which is a Roman administrative district, but also a church administrative district. And of course, the best part about them is they wage war against other Germanic tribes, particularly like the Saxons and the Lombards and people like that. Um, they wage war against them partly because they're pagans and partly because they militarily oppose them. They also wage war against the infidels, which we'll get to in just a wee little bit here. Now, Roman Christianity, what we can recognize as Catholicism, is extremely slow to penetrate these very robust Germanic societies. Now, the Franks are unusual in that they came in largely Christianized already. Most of them were Christianized, especially the leaders, the Merovingians and to a lesser degree the Carolingians were already Christianized. They had married into the religion, for lack of a better term. Now, there was a lot of competition for Christianity, particularly in the Germanic religions, which were extremely hardy. For the Germanic tribes, things were going very well. Thank you. We're getting new lands. We're going to war a lot. We enjoy this very much. It's, nothing is collapsing for us. It's only going up. So you have these very strong Germanic pagan religions, but you also have other Christian religions. And remember, I talked about that Council of Nicaea. Well, at Council of Nicaea, not everybody saw eye to eye. And so there were some who leave the council and say that the council has no authority over them, and they become known as heretical Christians. So you have the followers of a man named Arius that follow Arian Christianity. It's Arian, Arian Christianity, that believe that Christ was a really good guy. He wasn't divine, right? Wasn't divine at all. He was just a really, really good guy, and God showed His favor. He's much like Moses or Abraham, right? Moses and Abraham weren't sons of God, so why does Jesus get to be son of God, right? So you have the Arians, and there's a couple of other uh, heretical sects that are out there. And so they've already penetrated into the Germanic areas a couple of centuries back. And so you have a Christian saying that these other Christians are incorrect. So there's a lot of confusion, right? And there's also a need for adaptation. The Christianity, as you understand it in the fourth century, is a very Mediterranean centered religion. And so Christianity needs to adopt and adapt to the proclivities and the tastes and the practices of the Germanic tribes, of these Northern European societies. And so Christianity adopts many pagan holidays. For example, Christmas happens to come right about the time that the Romans were celebrating the feast of Saturn. The so-called 12 days of Christmas that some people sing about, that's actually the 12 days of Saturn. It's called the Saturnalia. During those 12 days of the Saturn festival, you would go and visit friends, you would bring gifts, you would get drunk, you would have a great time. It was 12 days of partying. The 12 days of Christmas, right? Or Easter, for instance. Easter was a celebration of the Germanic god Ostara. Ostara was the goddess of the spring, and you celebrated with creatures that were very fecund or very fertile, right? And so, for example, rabbits. Rabbits were sacrificed to Ostara to ensure that the new spring would come. Things like eggs. Eggs had the potential for life, and so eggs were used as a symbol of the springing of life from unlife. So just like plants come from the ground, seemingly by magic, so too chickens would hatch from eggs seemingly by magic. Chickens lay a bunch of eggs. Not all of them are fertilized. So sometimes you would have eggs that would go bad. Sometimes you had eggs that became chickens, right? So if you ever wondered why Easter is associated with rabbits and eggs, kind of a tenuous association, but there you go. So you have Christianity adopting a lot of the many pagan practices, but you also have pagans adopting Christian kind of ideology and Christian rhetoric and Christian symbology. So eventually, over time, the two were going to become fused into one. Eventually, into this mix, we're going to throw another religion, just temporarily, so bear with me. In the 7th century, Islam begins to spread through the Middle East, through Eastern Mediterranean and across Northern Africa. By the time we get to the early 8th century, we have Muslims who have invaded and now control Spain. By the mid 8th century, that control of Spain allows them to springboard into France or into Gaul. And this is what changes the fortunes for those Germanic tribes that are living in Gaul and what makes Gaul into France. And that is the Battle of Poitiers, which is in 732, also known as the Battle of Tours. It's a group of Frankish warriors stopped this invasion of Muslims. And this is where I was talking about the Franks oppose infidels. They stop the invasion. Now, the Muslim army has been very unstoppable so far. In fact, in the east, another arm of a Muslim army has pressed the Byzantines back and back and back into Anatolia and really shrunk the territory that the Byzantines have. The Byzantines are having a rough time fighting the Muslims. The Byzantines are also fighting the Germans, trying to get control of Rome again, but that's a story for another day. And the victory at Poitiers, or the victory at Tours, whichever battle you prefer to call it by, um, hinges on a simple yet surprisingly effective change in the way that cavalry is deployed. Some of the equipment that are necessary for cavalry, of course, is a saddle. Well, up until about 730, the use of a little loop of leather sewn into the saddle, known as a stirrup, was unusual. It wasn't unheard of, and they didn't really invent it, but they made it much more prevalent after this battle. It was seen as somewhat restricting, or seen as kind of like having training wheels on your horse, basically, to any serious horseman. But the Franks used these consciously because it allowed heavy cavalry to slam into and charge into formations. It allowed heavy cavalry to break up other cavalry's charges. Why? And you got to think about it this way. If you don't have your feet in stirrups and you're just sitting on the back of a horse, whether it's on a saddle or not, if you're moving forward and you hit something with a lance, the energy is going to translate into your body and push you off the back of the horse. So the faster you're going, the more likely you are to get pushed off the back of the horse. Your legs squeezing under the side of the horse don't help, right? However, if you have your feet in stirrups, you're not squeezing onto the side of the horses, you're pushing down on the stirrups with your feet. So you can brace for that impact and it keeps you from sliding off the back of the horse. So the heavy cavalry allows for the Franks to defeat the Muslim invaders. And eventually the Carolingians, who for various reasons were leading the military and not the Merovingians, who were technically king, were given kind of the okay to eventually take over. And eventually you have the greatest of medieval European kings emerge from the Carolingians. Charlemagne, or Charles le Magne, Charles the Great. Uh, Charlemagne was the grandson of the general who led the charge against the Muslims, and Charlemagne was the epitome of this kind of medieval power consolidating, empire building Frankish king. He emulated a lot of the conquests of the Romans. He was constantly at war with his neighbors, used that treasure and those thralls that he was able to get, slaves he was able to get, to help build his kingdom and project his power even further. He patronized learning. He patronized the papal territories. He protected them. So he became he became the protector uh, of the Holy See. He was also crowned Holy Roman Empire, or sorry, Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in 800 AD, because his power was such that he was able to influence the Pope. He was able to influence other societies. Charlemagne's capital wasn't in Rome, though. It was at Aachen, or Aix-la-Chapelle, right? And his palace was very Romanesque. It was very villa-like. And unlike some of his contemporaries, he had rebuilt these Roman baths underneath his villa. Partly because of the healing properties that are associated with it. It's a very sulfurous, salty spring, hot spring that comes up. And you can imagine if you've been out fighting for months, you come back and get a nice big soaky bath, you start feeling better, start feeling more human, that you can ascribe healing properties to that. He rebuilds Roman roads not just to help advancing his army, but also to promote trade within his empire. And he also becomes a patron of monasteries. Monasteries are the centers of learning and preservation of knowledge. So he establishes a German take on a empire, on the Roman Empire. It's not truly Roman, but it's Roman-esque. It's the kind of emulation of Roman greatness. He's constantly at war with other people in order to prove that he has the right to rule, and that's how the Franks become kind of the centerpiece of the stick that is European society. The Franks sponsor churches when they sponsor the construction of churches. So not just Charlemagne, but his descendants begin to patronize local churches and monasteries. And churches are eager to accept these donations because that means they can build cathedrals, they can build monasteries. But it becomes kind of a system of this for that, quid quo pro. The church becomes enmeshed in the power of European society. They educate the nobility, which means they have kind of a emotional and intellectual hold over the nobility. The church eventually begins to own land. They safeguard so-called relics or bits and pieces of saints. They also collect tithes, which is a form of taxes, with which they can grow crops, they can levy troops, so they kind of become a parallel power, the church does, within European society. But there's also a lot of good things that are going on. Just as in China, monasteries become the centers of learning and the preservation of European knowledge. There are some Greek and Latin learning that continues, philosophy, medicine, mathematics, astronomy. A lot of these continue on in the medieval period. The monasteries provide education for well-connected individuals, and the monasteries act as a kind of communication network amongst different kingdoms. So you have monks that are often acting as emissaries or as diplomats. They often send out missionaries. They send out pilgrims along these routes to try to unify European identity. Not exactly successful in that aspect. You never get the rise of another Roman Empire, or at least not a long-term Roman Empire, the way that you do in China, replacing the Han Dynasty. So I want you to think about the relationship between Christian monks and their powerful sponsors. Now, initially, much like their Buddhist counterparts in China, the order originally rejected materialism in order to lead simple life and maintain its can they maintain their core message if that is no longer possible? If they're showered with gifts, can they reject materialism? Now, medieval leaders, kings, barons, dukes, whatever, princes, they obviously understood that their actions were sins, that they're going out and murdering people, they're going out and raping people, they envy other people's goods or power or wife or whatever. They often lied. They betrayed each other. So they knew their actions were sins. So why did they keep doing them? Well, it explains a little bit more in your book, so I won't go into it too much here. And so, what does that mean for the message of Christ and Christianity? Does Christianity stay the community-based, pacifist-based religion that it was before, say, the Nicene Creed or the Nicene Council? And I've given you some passages to look up and see if this meshes with the reality of Europe. Both Christianity and Buddhism offer comfort and solace in this period of dramatic upheaval. And Buddhism and Christian monasteries serve as repositories of knowledge, learning, and science. But can we really call the medieval periods in China and Europe dark ages if they preserved the light of knowledge and eventually overspread their respective societies? Can we call these periods dark ages? All right, that's it for this week. Kind of a longish one, chapter 7 and 8. Don't forget, this week is the midterm. There's lots of questions, a lot more points. Take your time, okay? If you have any questions or concerns, please let me know as soon as possible, and I'll see you again next week.